coordinate systems. I think we have repeated this about 5 times already, the 6th time again. So within SPICE, reference frame is specified by orthogonal axis, maybe fixed in space, not rotating, not accelerating, then it's called inertial frame, or it may be changing orientation in space, and it's non-inertial. And every frame has a name and numeric ID, as I said in the A5 tutorial, and you will use name of the frame as the argument in most of your toolkit API calls. And every frame has an associated center, but that center is only used to do lifetime corrected orientation of the frame. And for a coordinate system, on the other hand, is a method used to specify vector within the reference frame. And examples are, here's just your Cartesian vector, x, y, z. Here's the same vector represented in spherical coordinates with latitude, co-latitude, and radius, or cylindrical coordinate with latitude, height, and what is this called? Height. And what are the third coordinate and cylindrical? Radius? Radius, height, and latitude and longitude, right?
Yeah, we just call it z-axis for height.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on. Let's first say what SPICE frames do. They establish a relationship between reference frames used in geometry computations. The subsystem chains frames together. So it says this frame is related to this frame, related to this frame, and so on. So using this relationship, it can build long chains, and it connects frames with sources of their orientations. And in some cases, these data are included directly in the frame's kernel, but in most cases, they come from some other SPICE kernels. Based on these relationships and the orientation source information, the subsystem allows SPICE software, most APIs in SPICE software, to compute rotations between neighboring frames in a frame tree and combine these rotations in the right order. And this way it provides an ability to compute orientation of any frame in the tree with respect to any other frame in the tree at any time for which data to support these computations is provided. Well, let's look at a sample frame tree. In this case, again, we're using Cassini mission as example. Inertial frame J2000 is probably the core, the apex of it. There are quite a few body fixed frames for natural bodies, Saturn body fixed frame, Earth body fixed frame, Titan body fixed frame. All of those are based on PCK data, so you need to load PCK kernels, text, or binaries to provide these transformations. The spacecraft orientation is normally stored in C kernels, so the spacecraft frame would be CK-based, require CK-based transformation. The frames for many instruments that are rigidly mounted on spacecraft will be fixed offset transformation with respect to the spacecraft frame. And the same way, the topocentric frame at the landing side of the probe would be fixed offset frame with respect to the body fixed frame. So these are 4 classes of frames. As you can see, there are many frames of each of these classes. To remind you again that to use frames, to name frames, you would use frame names that are character strings, and you will provide them as input arguments to many toolkit APIs. Here are some examples: J2000 frame, Mars IU frame for body fixed frame of Mars. Dawn spacecraft is a Dawn spacecraft frame, as the name suggests. X Omega is the frame associated with Omega instrument, and DSS 14 Topo is a topocentric frame at the DSN station 14 site. So where can you find names of the frames? Please refer to NAIF-ID's tutorial for some introductory material. I presented it yesterday. Frames required reading document has a list of all built-in reference frames. Those that are hard-coded in the toolkit, and that includes all inertial frames supported in SPICE, and body-fixed frames for all bodies for which rotations are provided in the IAU rotation constants report. There are also a few other frames, such as ITRF93, also present in that list. For mission frames, such as spacecraft frames and frames for its subsystem and instruments, you normally will need to look at the mission's frames kernel. It will provide detailed comments, and of course you will see the frame definitions themselves. For names of the Earth station frames, you need to look at the FK for these stations, and there are multiple such files, one for DSN station and one for ESA stations, and I believe there is one for Russian stations as well. And you should refer to the Moon frames kernel for names and descriptions of the body fixed frames associated with the Moon that are supported by high precision orientation of the moon from binary PCK files. So let's see, there are 5 frame classes, and this slide gives examples of frames in each class. Inertial frames, ICRF, which is called J2000 and SPICE. There's plane, equator, and equinox of epoch frame. We have a frame called Mars IEU built into the toolkit. Please don't confuse it with IEU Mars, which is a body fixed frame based on BCK constants. There are a couple of frames that provide that are ecliptic of epoch frame, Eclipse J2000, Eclipse B1950. The second class is body fixed frames. These are based on PCK data. The first and biggest part of that set are solar system body IU frames based on rotational constants from IU report. They have, their names have IU prefix followed by the name of the body, IU Mars, IU Saturn, and so on. The high accuracy Earth frame, Earth orientation frame, ITRF 93 is built into the toolkit, and high accuracy moon orientation frames, Moon PA and Moon ME, are defined in the Moon frames kernel. CK-based frames, for example, names frames for the spacecraft, Cassini spacecraft bus, or Dawn spacecraft that was shown in the previous slide, and for moving parts of an instrument, such as robotic arm joints or mirrors, or Ferris instruments or articulating scanners. Fixed offset frames are usually used for non-moving instrument frames, such as Cassini ISS narrow angle camera, Cassini ISS NAC, and for topocentric frames for stations and for landers and rovers. There is a large family of frames called dynamic frames, using which you as a user can define all kinds of frames, geomagnetic frames, solar equatorial frames, planet, true equator, and equinox of day frames. There will be a tutorial covering these frames on the last day of the class. So depending on the frame class, frame is defined either in the toolkit or in the frames kernel, and its orientation is provided either in the toolkit or in one or more SPICE kernels. For example, all inertial frames are built into the toolkit software, and their rotation data with respect to each other is also built into the toolkit software. You can see all of them if you look at frames required reading. Body fixed frames, on the other hand, are both built into the toolkit software. This is true for body fixed frames for all bodies which have data in the IU report, or they can be defined in the frames kernel for other bodies for which report doesn't provide data. In most cases, though, the data for these body fixed frames will be provided by PCK files, either text or binary. CK-based frames are always defined in frames kernels, such as project frames kernels, and their data will be coming from CK files. Fixed offset frames are always defined in the frames kernel, and their orientation data with respect to some other frame is provided right there in the frame definition in the form of Euler angles or matrix or quaternion. Dynamic frames, which is the most complex category, are always defined in frames kernel, and their orientation data can be provided by the built-in models from the toolkit or computed using data from frames kernels, SPK, C kernels, and or PCK files, depending on what vectors are used in the frame definition. So here's, let's talk a bit about the frames kernel file. It's a text kernel. It doesn't contain very much data, but has a lot of comments. And this text kernel, it uses text kernel standards. As you can see, it's keyword equal value assignments. It's loaded using Furnish, like any other kernels. You can load it by itself or as part of the meta kernel. It usually contains comprehensive information about the frames, because without these descriptions, you won't understand what these keywords are actually defining. It's not enough to make this data known and available to SPICE. It's also important for you to realize that this particular frame is aligned in a certain way with the spacecraft structure. For example, with Z antenna pointing along from Z-axis pointing along high gain antenna, Z direction, and X-axis pointing towards instrument deck or something like it. It contains frame definition information consisting of a set of assignments in the data sections of the file, and here's a couple of examples. Here's a CK-based frame example and a fixed offset frame example. As you can see, there's some common keywords at the top of these two definitions. The first two actually establish association between the frame name, in this case Dawn spacecraft, and ID that's assigned to this frame. These are the keywords that are looked up by SPICE to do this name ID mapping, which I mentioned in the name IDs tutorial. The next keyword specifies the class of the frame. 3 is CK-based frames, and 4 is fixed offset frames. The next keyword, class ID, contains ID using which SPICE will try to retrieve data for this frame from different kinds of kernels. For example, for CK-based frame, this ID is what SPICE is going to use to look data in C kernels. So it will call CK readers, and it will ask for orientation data for this ID, and if it finds it, it will return it to the high-level interfaces that were called with this frame name. For the fixed offset frame, this ID is actually used inside the keywords, embedded in the keywords that provide additional information about this frame. The frame center, defined in both cases, and it's used to do light-time corrected orientation of the frame, to compute light-time correction orientation of the frame. The CK-based frame have additional keywords. This one is quite important. It tells SPICE which clock ID to use to do conversion from ephemeris time, which is most frequently input to high-level interfaces, to encoded's clock with which data is tagged in the C kernel. So what SPICE will do, it will look for data for this CK ID with encoded clock, which was computed using this clock ID. So you can associate different frames with different clocks if there are multiple clocks on a mission, and some missions do that. For example, on ExoMars, there is actual clock correlation that's associated with ID minus 143, and there is a nominal clock correlation that's associated with ID minus 143,999. The nominal correlation never changes, and that's what's used to produce predicted C kernels. For the fixed offset frame, as I mentioned, the orientation is provided directly in the frame definition. In this case, we see that this orientation is provided as Euler angles with these values for this rotation axis sequence. These are provided in degrees, and you can see they're all zeros, but normally they would be non-zeros for any alignments that are based on real measurements. And that this orientation provides rotation from the dawn spacecraft frame to the dawn framing camera frame. Okay. So the routines that deal with frame transformations are the SX form, PX form, and PX form 2, which compute state and position transformation matrices. They are very simple calling sequences. You tell them from which frame to which frame you want this rotation to rotate vectors, and at what time you want it to be computed, and they return you either 6x6 matrix or 3x3 matrix. Of course, frames are used throughout the SPICE system, and frame name is normally an input to most high-level APIs, including SPK ECR and SPK pause routines, which compute state and position vectors in the specified frame. In this case, you specify your frame by giving its name as a third argument, and the output vector, either position vector or state vector, will be rotated to this frame after all the additions, all individual vectors were computed and rotated and added to the inertial frame. These are, of course, Fortran examples. You already know how to map these to the API names in the language of your choice. So there are a few things to remember. As we already mentioned, C kernels have gaps, and when you access CK data through frame subsystem, you need to remember about it, because for discrete C kernels type 1, the orientation of a CK-based frame will be computed only at the times that if these times provided to the frame routines exactly match those in the file. Usually it's not possible to get this exact match because of numeric round-off in time conversions. For this reason, type 1 C kernels, which there are very few of, are essentially unusable with any modern SPICE high-level interfaces. But as I said, because there's so few of them in practice, it's very little issue, because continuous C kernels from types 2 to 6, 3, 5, and 6 are most commonly used in US and European missions. The orientation can be computed during interpolation intervals, and it will be returned to you in whatever form the requesting routine wanted it. So when you're using SPK, EZR, and SX form interfaces, you need to have C kernels that contain angular rate data. These routines return state vectors 6x1 or state transformation matrix 6x2. Angular rate must be present in the C kernel to compute the lower bottom, lower left corner, 3x3 corner of the state transformation matrix. If it's not present, then error will be signaled. So if you don't need the velocity component of the state vector and only need position, you can use instead SPK pos and PX form routines, which will return 3x1 and 3x1 vectors and 3x3 matrices. And these can be used with C kernels that don't contain angular rate data. Well, in practice, majority of C kernels do contain angular velocity data because we try to work with all C kernel producers to make sure that this data is available and included in order to allow using all of the SPICE interfaces with such CK files. And finally, the ephemeris time that's input to the frame routines is converted to sklog time to access C kernels, and for that, both sklog kernel and leap second kernels must be loaded. And sklog ID is specified in the CK frame definition, as I showed in the previous slide, using the sklog keyword underscore sklog keyword. And if that keyword is not present, then it's just assumed by dividing the frame ID by 1,000. Here's an example of real frame tree from Mars Express frames kernel. It shows frames of interest to the Aspera instrument. In this case, we start with J2000. We have PCK-based frames for the Earth and Mars. There is a CKA-based frame for Mars Express spacecraft. Then we have a fixed frame for the Max Aspera scanner, for Max Aspera scanner base. The articulating scanner frame is called CK Aspera ASF for scanner articulating facility. I don't remember exactly. So the data for this frame is provided from C kernel, and there are multiple sensors mounted on this scanner, so their frames are fixed offset frames with respect to the scanner. So in order for someone to compute orientation of this detector with respect to the Mars body fixed frame, which would be needed to analyze particle environment around Mars, one would need to have PCK file, C kernel file, PCK file to provide Mars rotation, CK file for the spacecraft and for the scanner, and the frames kernel that provides this fixed offset. But if all these kernels were loaded, then a single call to PX form routine will return a 3x3 transformation matrix between any of these detector frames and the Mars body fixed frames without you needing to know anything but names of these frames. So it really makes it very convenient. So there are some utility programs, FrameDiff, included in the toolkit. Very handy utility. It can sample orientation of a frame, and that frame can be a CK-based frame. CK brief summarizes coverage of CK files. Brief summarizes coverage of PCK files, binary PCK files. There are additional FK and frames utility programs provided on the website under Utilities page. Pinpoint can create topocentric frames kernel for fixed locations such as ground stations or landing sites, and Bingo can convert text files between Unix and DOS formats. There's a lot of documentation on frames kernel. Of course, there's an online version of this tutorial that has a bit more slides. Frames required reading is a great document that describes all classes of frames and provides examples of frames if you were to try to make your own frames. Using frames tutorial, which I'm going to present in a minute, dynamic frames tutorial, which I will present at the end of this class on the last day, name IDs tutorial that you already heard as a reference for frame name and ID formation rules, headers of routines mentioned in this tutorial, most useful SPICE routines, and so on. Questions?